Hello and welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, an independent podcast focused on geopolitical risk to serve decision makers working in specialty insurance markets, reinsurance and beyond. For episode 6, our focus is on the consequences of the closure of the Black Sea grain corridor deal, not just for Ukraine, but its potentially destabilising impact on African food security and African political stability. I'm your host David Benyon, and I'm very pleased to say I'm joined by Crispin Hodges, Head of Trade Political Risk at Canopius Group. Crispin, I understand that you've worked in the market as a broker, as an underwriter, and that you're fluent in quite a few languages too. So before we get into the actual topic itself, what is it about political risk that was so beguiling to you, and what's been your route into this part of the insurance market?
Well, David, I've come from a sort of insurance family. My father was an aviation broker at Lloyd's for his whole career and traveled the whole time, fascinated by geopolitics, fascinated by the economies of other countries. He spent most of his career dealing with Latin American jets. So I got to travel at a very young age because of his work. In addition to which, my mother was Lebanese. So I had sort of a homegrown political risk interest as it was. And Lebanese family moved over here when the Lebanese Civil War started. So I had that very front and center in my childhood. Obviously, having a family who are either travelers or, from a country that speaks lots of languages, I had an interest in speaking foreign languages. I ended up reading French and Spanish at UCL and ended up becoming trilingual, which to my Lebanese family was very disappointing because they all spoke 5 languages. But to my English family was actually brilliant because they all spoke 1. And at the end of university, I did what a lot of people did, which was to apply to anybody who'd have me. And I applied to 40 brokers and underwriters and got 1 job offer and 1 interview and took it to become an FI underwriter at Chubb. Swiftly moved to become a broker at Willis. And then opposite the team I was at Willis on the other side of the hallway was the political risk team, which seemed to be having a huge amount of fun. The fascinating job they did with their client base and looking at geopolitics around the world. And I realized that that's what I wanted to get into. And that was 25 years ago. So I started off first broking in political risk. And then after a couple of firms of broking, I moved onto the underwriting side, initially to go to Singapore, followed by Paris, followed by Dubai, and then back to London.
Wow. So you're pretty well traveled even once you got into the political risk market.
Yeah, I've always been a big part of my life. I've lived in Egypt, Zimbabwe, Mexico, quite a few holiday hotspots. So I've always been interested by it.
Okay, so let's move on to the topic in hand for today. So the closure of the grain corridor. But before we get into the effect in Africa, let's just go over the developing situation in the Black Sea. So give us a bit of a summary of the current situation with the Black Sea and how that relates to the closure of the grain corridor.
Sure. So in February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and effectively blockaded the Black Sea ports, in doing so, they blockaded in the region of 20 million tons of grains, be they barley, wheat, maize, corn, etc. That obviously had a huge impact on global food prices, which has a huge impact on developing nations predominantly who are importers for those grains. As a result of that, in July 2022, a few months after the invasion, a Turkish brokered agreement was put in place that allowed for a grain corridor, which is effectively a nautical corridor of 310 nautical miles long by 3 nautical miles wide, to enable the exports of those grains to come out of the Ukraine, to enable it to go to the people who need it most around the world, and therefore help to suppress food inflation from a pricing perspective. When that was initially put in place, prices did come down about 20%. And during the 12 months the grain corridor was in place, the estimates are around 33 million tons of grain were enabled for export as a result of the plan being put in place. July the 17th this year, Mr. Putin decided to terminate the grain corridor agreement. And what that has meant is, thankfully, during the interim period, the Ukrainians had found ways to actually get the grain out through different routes. Some of it has been through using the River Danube and using ports such as, and this is where my pronunciations are really pretty hopeless, Ismail and Reni. And those ports mean that they can actually get the grains on canals effectively or down rivers, and then get them to ports that are often in Romania to get them on the open sea. Challenge with that, of course, is that part of that process is going to be by river. Sometimes they're doing it by train. If they try and do it by train into Europe, the Ukrainian train gauges are different to EU train gauges.
Yeah, and also I assume that you can't transport the same volumes by train.
You can't transport the same volume. It's a lot more expensive, but also the moment it gets from effectively the Ukrainian end of the line to the EU start of the line, and the gauge is different for the trains, all of that grain has to be physically lifted from one load of Ukrainian cars onto a load of EU compliant cars from a gauge perspective.
Yeah.
So it's time consuming, it's expensive, it's not an ideal way to go about.
This has been a problem for centuries. I think the Germans had this problem in the Second World War. All the trains with the wrong gauge. That's right. A logistical nightmare.
It's a huge pain and obviously a very expensive way of going about things. With the Russians cancelling the grain corridor initiative, they have then started targeting those River Danube ports with drone attacks and the like to really try and cut down Ukraine's operations. Ukraine, on the flip side of it, has also been targeting with drone attacks the Russian operations. So what that has effectively meant is that there's an estimate that says that since this occurred in July, Ukrainian exports are down about 90% through the Black Sea. But they are still trying to get them out through Poland, Romania, Moldova, and so forth. The challenge with it, of course, is that those countries don't want to be flooded with wheat, grain, barley, etc. They want to have their own domestic needs met. They're okay to allow a lot of this to pass through, but they don't want it sitting in country. One of the statistics that is often said about Ukraine's production of wheat and grain is that they produce 10% of the world's grain, if you like. They don't. They produce 3%. They produce 9 to 10% of the exports, because the countries who are the biggest wheat producers, China, Russia, the US, they use a huge amount of the wheat they produce for domestic consumption.
Right.
So with Ukraine, because obviously they have a much smaller population than those countries, the 3% of wheat production they actually generate translates into 9 or 10% of global wheat exports. So it is actually a very big number for that to be diminished by due to the actions of the Russians.
It's fair to say there's not much volume coming out of the Black Sea now, though.
There's certainly a few vessels getting out, but it's nothing like the volume that needs to.
But this should also affect Russian exports as well as Ukrainian exports, right?
They are affected, but not so much. It's far more the Ukrainian side that's been affected. That being said, both sides have threatened to target each other's grain ships. And that, I think, would be quite a significant problem if they did follow through on that. The Russians have effectively said that any vessel now could potentially be something they deem to be carrying weapons or arms, and therefore is a potential target. One of the sort of conditions of the grain initiative when brokered by Turkey was that the Russians can inspect vessels to determine that there aren't weapons going into Ukraine to support the Ukrainian war effort. And one of the reasons that they pulled out, they said, was that 57% of Ukraine's wheat exports were going to developed countries. Sorry, 57% of the developing nations, 43% to developed nations, the top four being sort of Spain, Turkey, Italy, China. And I think the Russians said that, the whole point of this grain corridor was to be able to support, if you like, the developing nations, particularly in Africa, who have such a dependence on imports of wheat in particular, but also corn, barley. Between Russia and Ukraine, they make up 80% of the world's exports of sunflower oil. So when the system and the logistics are broken, that has a direct impact on the nations that require those goods.
So if the grain corridor stays closed and supplies are constrained, and they certainly will become more costly, how will that impact emerging economies reliant on those exports?
Well, I think the one we mentioned is Egypt. As the sort of the largest importer of wheat globally. If you look at sort of the statistics for Egypt in 2020, a year or so before the conflict, they imported $5.2 billion of wheat just to Egypt on prices back then. The second largest, to give you an example of the scale of how much they need as a country of that size, the second largest was China, who imported $3.47 billion of wheat, because obviously China is a domestic producer in their own right, one of the largest in the world. I think the fears that one would have if the grain corridor is not reinstated, and I should clarify that President Erdogan of Turkey has said that he feels that post meetings in Sochi with Vladimir Putin, that he will be able to get the corridor initiative reopened. Putin has said he will not do so until the West makes some concessions to Russia. One of his concerns being that although Russian agricultural products aren't necessarily specifically sanctioned from the point of view of getting them out to get to developing nations and to the need of importers, actually banks, insurers, vessel owners don't really want to be getting into the sort of the messy part of trying to make it work with the Russians. So they're effectively avoiding that Russian agricultural business. And so Putin's finding that very frustrating, because obviously he was hoping the quid pro quo for the grain initiative would mean that Russia can get their exports out from a food perspective. But I think if one looks at what happens if this doesn't get reinstated, if we don't see the grain corridor being reopened, is that countries like Egypt will have a significant challenge when it comes to their imports of wheat and the sustainability of how they're going to manage to pay for it, but how they're also going to manage to get the right volume to bring in. And that, of course, then can foment civil unrest if people can't get their daily bread.
So for countries that are particularly vulnerable, Egypt being a big one, well, it's more than 80 million people, isn't
Correct,
it?
yeah.
It's an unholy combination, isn't it? We've seen this before. If you track both things on a graph, if you've got food prices are rising, and depending on the country, whether you've got a lot of unemployed young men, that tends to lead to civil unrest.
It does. And I think, one of the things to mention is that Ukraine was responsible, whilst this initiative was in place, was responsible for delivering 725,000 tons of grain to the World Food Programme. And the World Food Programme obviously supports some of the most neediest nations and peoples in the world for their just basic food requirements. Well, obviously, Ukraine's number is going to diminish significantly as a result of what's happened. It's estimated by the UN that, and this is totally separate to the war in Ukraine, but it's estimated by the UN that 50 million people across Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, and one other country in that part of Africa are in great need of food aid, not to do with the Ukrainian war, just to do with very poor rains over the last few years, which meant their local crops haven't reach the level that's needed. So if you've got 50 million people who need food aid across just 4 countries, then to be in a situation where the primary supplier to the World Food Programme is having their exports prevented from leaving is a very big knock-on effect.
For Sub-Saharan Africa, relevant to some of the countries you just mentioned, but we've seen coups recently in a couple of places. So what are the Russians doing, meanwhile, in Sub-Saharan Africa? What's their part in this? We saw Putin offer to give grain for free to several African countries.
Yeah, so he has offered to give, I believe it was thousands and thousands of tons of grain to several African nations, ostensibly for free. But there will no doubt be tags attached to that to do with, I'd imagine, political affiliation.
No one ever gets a free lunch.
Well,
but
no one
also
ever gets a free lunch.
It's probably worth mentioning as well that it's quite possibly stolen Ukrainian grain anyway.
There is an estimate that 6 million tons of grains have been exported in the last 12 months from Ukraine from occupied territories around Crimea. So, again, that's 6 million tons on the world market that have come from occupied territories.
If, let's say, there's a new military government in a sub-Saharan African country and Russia has Wagner to offer them, and it has an armaments industry that's struggling to meet its own demands at the moment, but arms are a huge Russian export.
It also has foodstuffs to offer them. And that's, I think, the primary concern is that if Russia is able to deliver a large quantity of basic foodstuffs to developing nations in sub-Saharan Africa, then they can buy goodwill in doing so. There are some countries that obviously have realized that actually the reason that their prices have all gone through the roof is because Russia invaded Ukraine. Ghana has been very vocal in its negative view of Russia and its actions, but numerous other countries haven't been. And part of the reason for that is Russia has pledged a huge amount of free foodstuffs to be delivered. I think that in doing so, what Russia's trying to do is to effectively curry favor, get a seat at the table. Actions like that, particularly where we've seen 8 or 9 coups in the Sahel over the last couple of years, in Burkina Faso and Mali, and so they've even done a sort of buy one get one free and had a couple of coups each. I think we see a situation where if a regime is newly into power, and they are able to provide foodstuffs to the population very quickly as a result of a Russian gift, that legitimizes their position quite quickly. And so I think what he's trying to do is to gain a seat at the table in a lot of those countries where they may be quite mineral rich, they may be resource rich for metals and the like.
It all seems so cyclical, because if you've got a coup that happens, for example, because of food insecurity and the price of grain, and the military government that then takes power is friends with Russia, they're not going to draw the link that the Russians are actually the cause of the problem that led to the coup. But they certainly will need friends, and the West is not going to give aid to the same degree as they would a democratic government. So the new military dictatorship will obviously turn to friends that don't have strings attached for the aid they give, and the Russians are a prime example of that, whereas in the West there are usually strings.
Well, yes, I think the strings are different sorts of strings.
I was going to ask you about President Macron. So Sub-Saharan Africa, the French have, for decades, to go back to what Charles de Gaulle once said, viewed themselves as the gendarme of their former colonial empire in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's possibly an outdated view. It's not particularly politically correct to say that, but that's certainly the historical view of Paris. Whereas it does seem that Macron is perhaps Putin's best asset, because he's not particularly successful diplomacy recently in the region.
That's very accurate, David, I think. It seems to be that wherever President Macron steps foot in Africa, he offends the regional government, the local leadership, and damages France's position in those African countries by his very presence. I think whilst one can make light of the fact that he does seem diplomatically to be quite stumbling, frankly, from the West point of view, France's diminishing position in Africa, leading to Russia and China's positions growing, is not good for the West as a whole. And I think we can see that in his interactions with numerous Francophone nations in Africa, he has alienated the French dynamic of what they're looking to achieve there very quickly by irritating the local president, prime minister, whoever it may be, which then is almost like an open door for Putin to come along and say, well, look, you don't have to deal with these former colonial masters who clearly don't treat you with the level of respect that you deserve. You can deal with us. And I think that's certainly something that we're seeing more of. And it's not good for the West as a whole, because, of course, where that relationship vacuum is created by Macron's sort of stumbling diplomacy, it results in us seeing Russia and China more pronounced.
I don't mean to suggest that the French don't have very good reasons for being in the region. I mean, they've had thousands of peacekeepers actively trying to suppress and stop jihadi activities in that part of the world for many years. Whilst that's in the locals' interest, you start to mention mineral-rich economies in that part of the world. And certainly what the Russians, I would expect, is if Wagner were replacing, a Western military, they're only going to protect the assets that are in their interest to protect, whereas the French would probably do a little bit more of a better job at being fair, you'd expect.
Well, interestingly, the French peacekeepers in most of those countries were there to try and control and or eradicate the jihadist threat. If you look at countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, where they've had, and these are resource-rich countries, they have a lot of gold and so forth, they've had their challenges with their own jihadist threat, which hasn't been dealt with by the French peacekeepers to the extent that the local governments wish, but also has been ostensibly the cause for military coups. The military coups are driven predominantly around saying, well, the government aren't doing enough to deal with our jihadist threat. We therefore need to step in and do it ourselves. And that's happened now in Burkina Faso, Mali and elsewhere. But funnily enough, those countries form part of the countries that are they're going to be the recipients of this 50,000 tons of grain from the Russians. The Russians are, I think he announced it was end of July, 27th of July, he announced he'd be sending 50,000 tons of grain to Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, Eritrea, and the Central African Republic. Free of charge, obviously, but that was only 10 days after he exited the grain initiative in Ukraine. So that 50,000 tons of grain is going to be a sticking plaster, but it's a plaster that'll last for a while.
How might all of this activity threaten political risk insurance within the region? Well, not just threaten, also opportunities, product demand, but also claims activity.
Well, so I think we're dealing with several factors here. We're dealing with what's actually going on in Ukraine and Russia, and then we're dealing about the knock-on effects of what happens particularly in developing nations in Sub-Saharan Africa, where if we look at the Ukraine and the Russia aspects of it, well, Ukraine, obviously, there's marine risks there from a marine war perspective. The political risks are well publicized from the point of view of expropriation and confiscation of assets in occupied areas and areas that might then be occupied at a later date. We obviously have, from a political violence perspective, we're seeing obviously damage to assets, to warehouses. A warehouse full of grain is worth a lot of money. And, since Russia pulled out of the grain initiative in July, they've been specifically targeting grain warehouses in Odessa and the like, which therefore means obviously you're talking about in the millions of dollars of values. A lot of these warehouses, just even when they're empty, are worth a lot. So when they're actually full of the underlying commodity, the values are huge. When we look at that sort of aspect of it, we're looking at political violence, we're looking at marine war. We're also sometimes looking at cyber, potentially looking at marine cyber. If the Russians are able to get control of a vessel and run it aground, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of challenges in what we can see coming out of Ukraine and Russia from a risk perspective. Just to be clear, at today's date, we don't write any political risk in Ukraine because we just don't see how it could be written at today's date. I appreciate there are initiatives in place to try and do so to enable the Ukrainian economy to get back on its feet. But it's very challenging as a private market insurer to look at how on earth we can underwrite those risks at today's date and control it in a measured fashion. When one then looks sort of down to the importers of these commodities, to the likes of Egypt, to the likes of the sub-Saharan African nations we just mentioned, well, one of the problems there is going to be if they don't get the right level of food at the right price, there'll be unrest. And then we start looking at strikes, riots, civil commotion. We start looking at threat to assets, threat to property. We then start to look at, as so often happens in these flare-ups, one country can be targeted as being seen as, well, it's because of them not doing something that this is happening in our country. And a lot of the time, one could be talking about a very young or poorly educated group who are quite easy to control. And in that situation, we saw years ago, we saw situations in Asia where problems in certain governments were deemed to be driven by the Americans. And so suddenly American hotels were targeted. And they had nothing to do with any of the underlying challenges in that country, but they were targeted by rioting groups and the like. So if we look at that and think, well, if these people fundamentally can't get enough food, and we're not talking, fancy things here, we're talking about really basic foodstuffs. If they cannot get basic foodstuffs to point of sale at a price point that they can actually afford and a volume of it that they can afford, then that will lead to civil unrest. And that will lead to economies being significantly challenged. The Egyptian economy already is under a huge amount of strain.
It's never a stretch to turn on the TV and see an angry crowd setting fire to an American flag or an Israeli flag or
Correct.
a French flag. But the types of assets that might be affected. So if you've got somewhere like Egypt, there's an awful lot of Western business presence, but also you've got kind of luxury hotels,
Correct. Yeah.
places like Sharm el-Sheikh.
A lot of them are owned by big international groups that either have a branding that is recognizable as a US branding or a French branding or a UK branding. Yeah, and it all depends how those people end up being viewed, or those businesses end up being viewed.
And some of that business presumably comes back to London.
Yes, a lot of it does. A lot of it does. And a lot of it does. And, whether it's written or not, or whether it's, priced so high that it can't end up being written in London, has to go somewhere else that's cheaper, that may well happen. Obviously, don't forget, in London, you have a lot of, just Lloyd's itself being A+ rated is different to a lot of insurers who might be A-, who are regional insurers who might charge a lower rate.
And we know from experience just with the civil unrest in France this year that you already mentioned SRCC, but many of this risk wouldn't necessarily come to standalone political risk or political violence. It's going to fall within property or risk covers, I would imagine.
It varies. Sometimes it's in property or risk. Sometimes it's as part of global programs where the strikes, riots, civil commotion can be an add-on. Normally, if there's political violence and war, that would normally be either in a standalone political violence terrorism market, in the sort of crisis management market, or it would be as part of a confiscation program, an expropriation global program that a client purchases, and they have SRCC and PV as part of that as a sublimit, effectively. But yes, I think, the knock-on effects of the inability for developing nations to feed their populations economically and efficiently, both from a volume of goods they can access and at a price point they can pay, does therefore have an impact on the stability of those governments and of the population.
We already talked about some of the countries that have had coup activity recently, and it seems like it's fair to assume there could be some more of that to come in Sub-Saharan Africa. And also we've just referenced that not all of this business is necessarily got a political risk stamp on it. It could just hit other lines of business too, not necessarily political risk itself. So some of the Sub-Saharan countries that are vulnerable, you already mentioned that they're quite mineral-rich countries. Are there some other lines of business you could point to where you see this risk hitting the book, potentially?
A lot of these nations may be rich in copper, gold, precious metals and the like, and minerals that are needed for example, for the production of electric vehicles. I think if you're looking at some of these countries where you start thinking, well, are there going to be problems in the mining sector and therefore in mining insurance? Are there going to be problems in the energy sector? Are there going to be problems in construction? Are we going to have issues with construction risk? So it filters into can that filter into the engineering construction book? Can that filter into the energy book? Can that filter into other areas of businesses? I'm not talking about Canopius, I'm talking about the market as a whole. So I think that the trickle knock-on effect, one can see the immediate effect is potentially unrest and strife from the fact that people aren't getting the access to food they need. But the next part of it is more around how that impacts the economies locally, how that impacts their growth, their GDP predictions, and it has a knock-on effect that's staggered.
And as an underwriter within the political risk market, I assume this means that the outlook is somewhat mixed.
It is somewhat mixed. I think a huge part of what we do here in my team is we underwrite the client. And even if something comes through the door that looks like it's the most peachy of transactions, if we're not comfortable with the client, we won't touch it. And I think this has become more and more prevalent as we've seen the geopolitics of the world getting more and more complicated. It's around backing the right insured, and insured with track record, and insured with expertise, with boots on the ground, with knowledge, with integrity, that has good CSR policies, so they're not going to fall foul of local municipalities, local regional governments. It's about backing quality insureds in challenging environments. The whole point about what we do in the political risk market is that we are effectively finding the gems in very challenging business environments. Obviously, we're not always going to pick the right gem, and it's not always going to be the diamond we hoped it was going to be. But a big part of our underwriting process is getting that level of comfort with how the clients behave in the country of risk to determine whether they're going to have positive and fruitful interactions with regional government, with the local communities, often with local religious leaders who have quite a big sway over the local communities, and how they're going to effectively conduct themselves in quite often very impoverished nations that happen to be very resource rich.
I hope you enjoyed this wide-ranging conversation with Crispin. I think it highlighted the geo in geopolitics and the connectedness of some of the issues we talk about in the risk landscape on this podcast. Also, the different insurance products in the market, whether that's political risk, war risk, PV and others. You may have noticed that I've recently stopped referring to this in my introduction as a monthly podcast. Well, that's because demand has been strong, so in response I'm stepping up to make 2 episodes each month. So in the next month, you can expect 2 freshly baked episodes. One on the current situation in Israel and Gaza and its effects for the Middle East, and another on the scenario of a China-Taiwan crisis and blockade. So please stay tuned, follow, like, and subscribe. You've been listening to the Political Risk Podcast, hosted by me, David Benyon. My guest this time was Crispin Hodges of Canopius Group. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin provided the music.